operation and support costs at over $1 trillion across the F-35's 30-year life cycle. The Department has already deemed this unaffordable. It's setting targets to try to reduce this, and the Congress may want to consider whether these funding assumptions are reasonable in our current fiscal environment.
Suspend the quorum call.
Without objection, morning business is now closed. Under the previous order, the Senate will resume consideration of S-744, which the clerk will now report.
Calendar number 80, S-744, a bill to provide for comprehensive immigration reform and for other purposes.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent to call up amendment number 1208.
Without objection, clerk will report the amendment.
The senator from Utah,
I ask unanimous consent for the reading.
Amendment number 1208.
Without objection.
Mr. President, amendment number 1208 would require fast-track congressional approval at the introduction of the Department of Homeland Security border security strategies before the award of registered provisional immigrant, or RPI, status, and also before that status begins, before the eligibility for that status begins, and also at the certification of the strategy's completion before those receiving RPI status may become eligible to become lawful permanent residents, eligible to receive green cards. This would be a fast-track vote, one that would have to occur within 30 days after the triggering event within the executive branch. It would also be subject to a 51-vote threshold and would not be subject to a filibuster. It is a basic function of Congress to oversee the executive branch and to ensure that the executive branch is enforcing the law as enacted by Congress. In the area of border security, the executive branch, in both Republican and in Democratic administrations, has failed to fully enforce the laws passed by Congress. Just to give a few examples, the Secure Fence Act, which was enacted in 2006, still has not been fully implemented in that the fencing requirement, the fence segments required by that act, still have not been built. The U.S. Visit Entry-Exit System, which was put into place by legislation enacted in 1996, still is not fully implemented. And it's worth noting here that 40% of our current illegal immigrants are people who overstayed their visas. And it's very reasonable to assume that there's a significant connection between our failure to implement this entry-exit system called for by existing law and the fact that a sizable chunk, several millions, of our current illegal aliens are people who overstayed their visas. Polls overwhelmingly show that Americans do not believe that the border is secure currently, and that they also believe that we should secure our borders first before moving on to certain other areas of immigration reform. These are failures of the federal government. The American people cannot hold unelected bureaucrats in the executive branch, people like the Secretary of Homeland Security, accountable for those failures. The most direct line of accountability is from the American people to their members of Congress. In order to ensure that the voice of the American people is heard, Congress must be able to vote on the border security strategy and on the certification of that strategy as a condition precedent to allowing these RPI provisions to kick in, to allowing people to enter into the pathway to citizenship and advance towards citizenship in the coming years. To cut Congress out cuts out the American people. And that's exactly what this bill, without an amendment like this one, would do. So it is important to remember that to cut out Congress cuts out the American people, and that's what we're trying to protect against here. Opponents of my amendment have argued that they would be unwilling to rely on a majority of Congress to approve the border security plan as a condition for allowing the RPI period to open and to proceed. But has it ever occurred to them that it might be precisely because a majority of Americans won't approve the border security plan, or at least that they might not approve of it? Or perhaps it's not a good idea to move forward on sweeping new policies that will affect generations to come without the support of the American people? It is, after all, the American people who have to deal with the consequences of a dangerous and unsecured border. They will have to deal with cross-border violence. They will have to deal with the heartbreaking stories of human trafficking. They will have to deal with the drugs that are imported into their communities. They will have to deal with the economic effects and the added costs of public services associated with an ongoing unsecure border. Therefore, it is the American people who should be the ones who get to say whether or not the border is secure, not the elected, unaccountable bureaucrats who have a long track record of failing fully to implement objectives established by Congress, embodied in law. My amendment would restore the voice of the American people to this process, because, again, cutting out Congress means cutting out the American people. I strongly urge my colleagues to defend the rights of the American people, to weigh in on this important issue, and to support my amendment. Finally, Mr. President, I want to commend the House Judiciary Committee for passing the SAFE Act out of committee last night. The SAFE Act is an important step forward in improving interior enforcement, securing the border, and strengthening our national security. It also demonstrates that we can effectively pursue significant immigration reforms in a step-by-step approach with individual reform measures. The SAFE Act is by no means a small piece of legislation, but importantly, it focuses reform on particular areas that should receive bipartisan support in both chambers of Congress. First, let's secure the border. Let's set up a workable entry-exit system and create reliable employment verification systems that will protect immigrants, citizens, and businesses from bureaucratic mistakes. Let's also fix our legal immigration system to make sure that we're letting in the immigrants our economy needs in numbers that make sense for our country. Once these and other tasks, which are plenty big in and of themselves, are completed, or at least in progress, to the American people's satisfaction, then and only then can we address the needs of current undocumented workers with justice, compassion, and sensitivity. Since the beginning of this year, more than 40 immigration-related bills have been introduced in the House and in the Senate. By a rough count, I could support more than half of them, 8 of which have Republican and Democratic co-sponsors. We should not risk forward progress on these and other bipartisan reforms simply because we're unable to iron out each of the more contentious issues. So again, with respect to this amendment, amendment number 1208, I strongly urge my colleagues to support this amendment because we were elected not to delegate the power to make laws to other people. We were elected to make law. Identifying the precise moment at which the border is sufficiently secure, that it's a good time to open the pathway to legalization, the pathway to citizenship, whatever we end up calling it, makes a lot of sense to put that decision in the hands of the elected people, precisely because that decision is one that's difficult to identify. It's difficult for us to identify exactly what standards will satisfy the American people. We can make a rough approximation, but we should require a vote by both houses of Congress and an act of Congress submitted to the President for signature or veto before the RPI period is opened. We were elected to make decisions like these, and we shouldn't be outsourcing those to others who are not elected. Now, those who are not elected, who under the text of Senate Bill 744 would be empowered to make these decisions, are, make no mistake, they are well-educated people. They are well-intentioned people. And it is not that I'm saying that they categorically cannot be trusted. What I'm saying is that those are people who, however well-educated, however well-intentioned, do not stand for re-election at regular intervals, as we do. They're not elected by the people. They don't stand for re-election at regular intervals. And for the most part, they are insulated and isolated from the electoral process, which keeps all of us accountable to the people in whom the ultimate sovereign authority relies. For those reasons, I urge my colleagues to support Amendment 1208. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor, and I note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
flight test program. And of course, that's turned out to not be the case. And I would point out in the flight test program up to this point, we haven't actually tested any combat capability. We've tested the handling characteristics of the aircraft. We've done necessary precursors to testing actual combat capability. But the first time we'll be flight testing combat capability is in Block 2B. When we finally get the Block 2B software released to the test program, then we'll be flight testing some actual combat capability, although it will be limited and we'll have to wait till Block 3F. So my perspective is that what happened here is, unfortunately, at the onset of the program, back in the 90s, was what happens frequently, and that is that everyone got together in the department and basically deceived themselves about how hard the job was going to be and how expensive it was going to be. And then reality intruded, and reality always wins.
You used the word deception. We heard the word optimism before. It seems like they brought us to the same place. Mr. O'Hanlon, just briefly, I look at this, too, from the viewpoint of America's industrial base, our capacity to build what we need next, our capacities to sustain this innovation, creative spirit, and keep it in a safe place so that we can really entrust to the people who are doing it our national security, which in the last week or two has again been brought into question. How do you view this in terms of what we should have done with F-35 and what we may need in the future and whether we'd be ready for it?
I guess, Senator, one observation I would have is that I don't want to depend too much on just one company or just one airplane. And it goes back to your point about too big to fail. I think Lockheed's done a generally good job. And Lockheed's making a wonderful F-16 still, which is part of the airplane in my alternative. I want to make more F-16s for the United States. We're making them primarily or exclusively now, I think, for foreign customers. So I have nothing against Lockheed, but I do think the idea of having more than one airplane, more than one modern airplane in the works is a good one. And part of the alternative, therefore, that I propose is to focus on this X-47, this naval unmanned carrier-capable plane that is getting some attention, some resources right now, but the service's commitment to it, the Navy's commitment, is probably a little bit shaky, partly because their budget is so overstressed by the F-35. And so one of the lessons I would draw is make sure you have a couple or three things in the works when it comes to something as important as combat aircraft.
An action that was taken in the House yesterday with all the issues that we have to confront, whether it's continuing this economic recovery and job creation, dealing with immigration like we're trying to do here in the Senate, dealing with going to conference on the budget, which Chairman Murray has been pushing for day after day after day. You would think that the House would take up one of those matters. But instead, what do? They take up an extreme anti-choice bill. Clearly, House Republicans have learned no lessons from last year when voters resoundingly rejected their efforts to defund Planned Parenthood, restrict women's access to birth control, and slash preventive care for women and families. So the debate that they had in the House yesterday echoes of last year, when Republicans talked about, quote, legitimate rape, or a pregnancy from rape as, quote, a gift from God. In fact, the Republican sponsor of this bill said the incidence of pregnancy from rape was, quote, very low, unquote, an assertion that's flatly contradicted by the facts. Mr. President, I see my colleague Senator Murray is here, and I would just pause and ask her through the chair if she needs to speak first. Then I will complete and turn to her, and I so thank her for organizing us this morning. In November, voters sent the message that they want us to focus on real concerns, jobs, education, immigration reform. But now they're back. They're back in full force with an even more extreme anti-woman, anti-choice agenda. They should know this. The women of America are watching, and so are the men who support them. This House Republican bill that was passed by them yesterday is a frontal assault on women's health. It puts women in danger of becoming infertile, in danger of suffering serious complications arising from cancer, blood clots, kidney disease, or diabetes, just to name a few of these conditions. It is an attack on 40 years of settled law, and it criminalizes doctors. Furthermore, there's no real rape or incest exception. It just bans abortion by a date certain with no real rape or incest exemption. Let me explain this. The Republican sponsors of the bill claim there is an exception for rape and incest. Matter of fact, it wasn't in there and they quickly added it, but seriously, they don't fix the problem. Because what they do is say, yes, a woman can end a pregnancy if she's raped, but she has to report that rape. And it is true that many women choose not to report the rape for their own private and personal reasons. So when you tell a woman who's been raped and who is too scared to report it that she has to carry the rapist child to term, that is not a rape exception. That's an outrage. And when you tell a victim of incest who is too scared to report it that she has to carry that child to term, that is not an incest exception. It's re-victimizing someone who has suffered a horrific crime. 65% of rape victims don't report these crimes. There is no protection at all for those women in this bill. There is also no health exception. The House Republican bill has no health exception at all. It's a reckless disregard for the health of women. So, for example, if a woman will face serious complications, even life-threatening complications, if they continue a pregnancy, where they could suffer kidney failure, a worsening of breast cancer and ovarian cancer, there's no help for those women. So I would say, listen to the women who have suffered these problems. Judy Shackelford of Wisconsin, 4 months into her pregnancy, she developed a pregnancy-induced blood clot in her arm. The only guarantee that she wouldn't die and leave behind her 5-year-old son was for Judy to end the pregnancy. She and her husband made the difficult decision to terminate the pregnancy, and those congressmen playing doctor over there are telling her what she should do for her family. They are not doctors. Listen to Christy Brooks of Virginia. Christy was pregnant with her second child. After a 20-week ultrasound, she found out her daughter would be born with a severe structural birth defect and would suffocate at birth. She made the difficult decision of ending that pregnancy at 22 weeks. Then there's Vicki Stella. Vicki, I have met. She discovered months into her pregnancy that the fetus she was carrying suffered from major anomalies and had no chance of survival, zero. Because of her diabetes, Vicki's diabetes, the doctor determined that induced labor and cesarean section were both riskier procedures for Vicki than an abortion. That procedure not only protected Vicki from immediate medical risk, but it ensured that she could have more children in the future. And those congressmen over there want to get into her life and tell her what to do and tell her family what to do. Now, this bill is so extreme it would throw doctors in jail for 5 years for providing women with the care they need. And they talk about this brutal doctor that is now serving 2 consecutive life terms over there for what he did. Well, that's the way the system should work. If you break the law, as that doctor did, you go to jail. But don't change the law so that if a good doctor is trying to help a good patient, he or she risks going to prison. This bill is so extreme. A broad array of groups oppose that bill. The American Congress of Obstetricians and Gynecologists. They represent thousands of OBGYNs nationwide. They said that this bill is dangerous to patient safety and health. A coalition of 15 religious groups opposed the bill. And here's what they said. We believe, and Americans, including people of faith, overwhelmingly agree that the decision to end a pregnancy is best left to a woman in consultation with her family, her doctor, and her faith. Our laws should support and safeguard a woman's health, not deny access to care, unquote. So in closing, and before we hear from my colleague, let me tell you this. Speaker Boehner said last week that creating jobs is, quote, really our #1 priority. And Majority Leader Eric Cantor said, House Republicans are focused on creating jobs and restoring faith in government. No, they are not. They are continuing the war on women. If this is what their agenda is, why are they doing that? Why are they attacking 40 years of settled law? President Obama has threatened to veto this bill, saying it shows contempt for women's health and their rights. And here in the Senate, my friend and I, who are here, and many others, are going to block this dangerous and extreme bill. And with that, I would yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Washington.
Mr. President, I want to thank the senator from California for coming out today to let everyone know how extreme this bill is and how important it is that we send the message today that this bill is going to be what most Republicans know deep down already, the anti-choice bill that they passed yesterday, a bill to the New York Times called, quote, the most restrictive abortion bill to come to a vote in either chamber in a decade, is not going anywhere, is not going anywhere. The bill that they passed yesterday is a non-starter here in the Senate, and it is a non-starter with the overwhelming majority of American women. It is an attack on women's rights under the Constitution, and it is an attack on a woman's ability to make her own health care decisions. Mr. President, it was a bill that was motivated by politics, pure and simple, and it amounts to little more than a charade designed to appeal to a dwindling base. But it's a charade that will end here in the Senate today. Mr. President, even more than reminding House Republicans this bill has no chance of moving forward, I'm here today to provide a reality check. Because apparently, despite the one that millions of American women provided last November, House Republicans need another one. Despite the fact in states across the country, voters rejected one candidate after another who politicized rape and ran on restricting a woman's right to choose, House Republicans are now back at it again. Despite the fact they had to bring in a paid pollster to tell the entire Republican House caucus to stop talking about rape, apparently the message hasn't sunk in. For many Republicans, it's like 2012 all over again, which is to say it's more like 1950 all over again. A time when an all-male House Republican Judiciary panel can join together, all male, just like they did last Wednesday, to pass a bill that clearly ignores Roe v. Wade. At a time when the same panel could reject efforts to protect the life and health of a mother, or even reject efforts to make exceptions for rape or incest, a time when one of those panel members, a Republican representative from Arizona, can even trot out the idea that women aren't likely to become pregnant if they're raped. But it's not 1950. And that irresponsible and shameful claim has been debunked by doctors and experts of all stripes time and again. Mr. President, it's been 40 years since Roe v. Wade put the health care choices of women in the hands of women. We're not going back. But just as House Republicans need a reality check that American women aren't going to have the clock turned back on them, I also believe the American people need to know that House Republicans and those on the far right targeting women's health care aren't going away anytime soon either. In fact, I wish I could say new restrictions on women's health care choices that the House passed yesterday were a surprise, or that I thought that after last fall Republicans would magically see the light. I wish I could say I bought the rhetoric from some Republicans who've criticized their own because they believe we should be focused on jobs and the economy at such a difficult time. But the truth is, attacks on women's health care have not stopped, and apparently they will not stop. And that's because they are a core part of that party's philosophy. In fact, all we have to do is look back at the moment that Republicans in the House took power. If we all remember back to 2010, after campaigning, by the way, across the country on a platform of jobs and the economy, the first 3 bills that they introduced were each direct attacks on women's health in this country. The very first bill that they introduced, H.R. 1, would have totally eliminated Title X funding for family planning and teen pregnancy prevention, and included an amendment that would have completely defunded Planned Parenthood and would have cut off support for the millions of women who count on that. Another one of their opening round of bills would have permanently codified the Hyde Amendment and the D.C. abortion ban, and the original version of their bill didn't even include an exception for the health of the mother. And finally, they introduced a bill right away that would have rolled back every single one of the gains we made for women in the health care reform bill. That Republican bill would have removed the caps on out-of-pocket expenses that protect women from losing their homes or their life savings if they get sick. It would have ended the ban on lifetime limits on coverage. It would have allowed insurance companies to once again discriminate against women by charging them higher premiums. And it would have rolled back the guarantee that insurance companies cover contraceptives. And those were just their first three bills. Since that time, we've seen women targeted on everything from contraception to Violence Against Women Act protections to stripping the new protections provided under the Affordable Care Act. Through economic peril, budget crisis, record unemployment, the attacks on women's health have remained constant. On Capitol Hill, in state houses across the country, and at courtrooms at all levels, the fight against women making their own decisions about their health rages on. Madam President, Republicans have shown they'll go to just about any length to limit access to care. They have put politics between women and their own health care. They've put employers between women and their health care. They've even threatened to shut down the government over this very issue. They've shown that this isn't about what is best for women or men and their own family planning decisions. Instead, it's about political calculations. It's about appeasing the far right. And it's about their continued efforts to do whatever it takes to push their extreme agenda. But as we have seen with this latest effort, the deck is stacked against them because the Constitution is not going anywhere. And because senators like me and Senator Boxer, we aren't going anywhere either. Because women who believe Republicans shouldn't be making their health care decisions aren't going anywhere. And therefore, this bill is not going anywhere.
Would the Senator yield?
Yes, Madam President, I'd be happy to.
I would like to engage my friend in a colloquy. We are very fortunate, you and I, because we chair important committees here. Of course, all the committees are important. You, the Budget Committee, and I, the Environment and Public Works Committee. And both of us have worked hard to get important bills through the United States Senate. You, the budget of the United States of America, and for me, the Water Resources Development Act, which deals with making sure that the infrastructure around our water, our ports, is sound. About 500,000 jobs go along with it. And yours is critical because you attack the issue of jobs and deficits and the rest. So it seems to me, and I want to know if my friend agrees with me, that there is an agenda that the House, Republican House, can embrace to deal with what really is concerning the American people, such as taking your bill, the budget bill, to conference after they went out and campaigned all over the country saying we didn't want a budget, we passed a budget, and now they're stopping the budget, picking up and passing the Water Resources Bill or passing their own version of it if they want, certainly dealing with comprehensive immigration reform, which is critical, and I was disheartened to see Speaker Boehner say, well, I'm not that interested in comprehensive immigration reform. Well, why doesn't he take a look at the budgetary impact, which is so positive for our nation, of doing this, getting people out of the shadows, getting them to start businesses and work? So does my friend agree that there is no shortage of important and critical issues facing the American people that they could take up there other than an attack on women and women's health?
Well, Madam President, let me just respond this way. When I go home, and I go home every weekend, My constituents talk to me about this big word called sequestration and its impact on their lives, whether they've been furloughed and their paycheck is much smaller, or whether they're running a violence against women center and they're having to close down facilities, or whether they're sending their kids to preschool and teachers have been laid off, or whether or not their small little pizza shop in Kitsap County is going to have to close because so many people have been furloughed and cut back because of sequestration. And what they want us to do, Madam President, is to invest in our infrastructure, to invest in our education, to make our country strong for the future, and to quit governing by crisis, which is why I've come to the floor, as the senator from California knows, constantly to say we've passed our budget. The House has passed our budget. To solve this and to replace sequestration in a responsible and fair way, we need to get to conference. But we're being blocked by a handful of Republicans here on the Senate floor. And over in the House, they're not appointing conferees, and they don't want to go to conference, well, apparently because they want to just take the floor time to attack women's health care. Madam President, this is not what the country is telling us to do. They are telling us to do our job and get a budget done so they have certainty. They are telling us to do our job and make sure that we invest in the WRDA bill that Senator Boxer's worked so hard to do, so that the Corps of Engineer projects, whether it's a dam or whatever project they have at home that provides jobs and provides the kind of economy that they need, is taken care of. Madam President, they elect us to come back here and do the job of this country. So, yes, it is frustrating to me to have to come to the floor one more time to talk about abortion when we should be talking about the investments that need to be made, when we should be passing a budget, we should be investing in our children and their future and providing people with jobs and job training and research that is so important at universities across this country so that we can be a good place 30 years from now in this country and be competitive. Madam President, I would say to my colleague, yes, it appears to me that the country has an agenda that is vastly different than the House of Republicans and the far right.
Madam President,
Senator from California.
I think it really says it all here. We need to do our work on the issues that matter to the people. We need to make sure this economic recovery gains steam. We need to make sure we look at the sequester and fix it. We need to make sure we have, yes, deficit reduction, but investments. And we need to stand strong here in the Senate, and we will. And hopefully our House colleagues will change their mind. The Republicans over there set the agenda. Get to the business of the people and stop attacking women. And with that in mind, I ask unanimous consent to set aside the pending amendment and call up my amendment number 1240.
Without objection, the clerk will report the amendment.
The senator from California, Mrs. Boxer, for herself, and Ms. Landrieu, proposes an amendment number 1240 on page 919.
Madam President, I ask the amendment be considered as read.
Without objection.
Madam President, I rise in support of the Boxer-Landrieu-Murray Amendment number 1240, which is a very simple amendment. It has bipartisan support as well. It would require the participation of the National Guard and the Coast Guard in new border protection training programs. The underlying bill includes language authorizing specialized training for federal law enforcement agents who will be tasked with securing the border, to update them on how the law will impact their duties and their responsibilities. The bill specifically requires Customs and Border Protection, Border Patrol, and ICE officers and agriculture specialists at the border to undergo training on such things as identification and detection of fraudulent travel documents, civil rights protections, border community concerns, environmental concerns, and how agents should handle vulnerable populations, such as children, victims of crime and human trafficking. But the bill leaves out two important groups of federal officials who will be key to further securing our land and sea borders. They leave out the National Guard and the Coast Guard. The bill provides new authorization for the National Guard to assist Customs and Border Protection agents with border enforcement duties. In the case of the Coast Guard, the bill continues their large role with maritime border security, but the new training language excludes both the National Guard and Customs and Border. So we look at our bill as making a pretty easy fix. We don't think that it was intentional to leave these the National Guard and Coast Guard out of the training, so we simply restore it. And I noted that Senator Cornyn identified the same problem during Judiciary Committee consideration of the bill. This piece was tucked into a more controversial amendment, so it didn't pass. So this bipartisan idea, I think, needs to be taken out, it needs to stand alone, and it needs to pass, and I'm very hopeful it will. In closing, I'll list who's supporting us in this: National Task Force to End Sexual and Domestic Violence Against Women, Asian Pacific Islander Institute on Domestic Violence, Casa de Esperanza, the National Latina Network for Healthy Families, Futures Without Violence, Jewish Women International, National Coalition Against Domestic Violence, National Congress of American Indians Task Force on Violence Against Women, National Network to End Domestic Violence, National Organizations of Sisters of Color Ending Sexual Assault, National Resource Center on Domestic Violence, and the YWCA. So we have a big group out there that understands that these officers need that training. So with that, I would yield the floor, and I thank everybody for their indulgence allowing me this time to explain the amendment. And do I need to ask for the yeas and nays at this point? All right. Thank you.
The Senator from Nevada.
Thank you. I ask unanimous consent that the pending amendment be set aside. Call it the amendment number 1227.
Without objection, the clerk will report the amendment.
The Senator from Nevada, Mr. Heller, for himself and Mr. Reed, proposes an amendment number 1227. On page 861, line 9.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent for the reading be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Thank you. Madam President, the debate we're having in this chamber is incredibly important to our nation's future, and we simply can't afford to waste this opportunity to bring meaningful reform to America's immigration system. We have a chance to enact common sense reforms that will help fix a broken system that punishes those who simply want to work hard and play by the rules. Over the course of the next 2 weeks, we have an opportunity to enhance border security and to ensure that those coming to our shores do so in a lawful manner. In order to do that, we need to make sure that the underlying immigration bill actually addresses the issues and offers reasonable solutions that make sense. Let me be clear. In order to fix the immigration system, we must secure our borders. Attempting to bring about immigration reform while ignoring the problem at our borders makes no sense. I, like many of my colleagues, have repeatedly voted this week in favor of increasing border security. I think most Americans would agree that any reform legislation must include measures that stops unlawful entry into our country. The underlying bill recognizes the serious need for greater security at our borders and establishes a Southern Border Security Commission if state-based results are not achieved in a reasonable time. I, for one, hope that we secure our borders effectively and quickly so that no such commission is ever needed. The Southern Border Security Commission will be established only if the Department of Homeland Security fails to achieve effective control of the southern border within 5 years of the bill's enactment. Hopefully, we never recognize that scenario. But if for some reason the Southern Border Security Commission is needed, and if we fail to change the status quo after 5 years, then the states that are most affected by these issues must have a central role in fixing these problems. Let me be clear. My amendment, Heller 1227, does not endorse the creation of the Border Commission. It simply ensures that should the commission be required, it will be fully representative of states' concerns and state-based recommendations on how to achieve control of the southern border. The commission is primarily comprised of representatives from southern border states, including Arizona, California, Texas, and New Mexico, and is responsible for providing concrete recommendations to Congress and the administration on how to achieve control of the southern border should DHS fail to do so. but Nevada would not be guaranteed a voice on the commission despite the fact that Nevada shares contiguous borders with 2 southern border states and faces many of the same immigration-related challenges as these states. It's more than reasonable to argue that Nevada, which is a short drive away from San Diego, Los Angeles, and Phoenix, should be included on a commission designed to improve border security in the southwestern region. If that commission is necessary, Nevada should have a seat at that table. Including Nevada on the commission makes the underlying bill more effective, enhances this particular border security provision, and ensures that it fully addresses the issues affecting southern border and southwestern states. Madam President, if we reject common sense during this amendment process, we're going to end up right back where we started in years to come. And we're not going to give the American people the solution that they deserve in this immigration bill. It's common sense that if the federal government fails to gain control of the borders, then the states most affected by the failure should be able to play a role in fixing the problem. And it's common sense that states like Nevada, that faces the same problems as other states in the region, should contribute to the process as members of that commission. Madam President, I urge my colleagues to support this amendment, and I yield the floor.
Madam President.
The senator from New Jersey.
Madam President, I come to the floor with even more good news about the Gang of Eight's immigration reform proposal that is being debated before the Senate. The nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office has confirmed that this legislation we are considering is good for the American economy. Now, we in the Gang of Eight have spent months working on this bipartisan effort because we knew it was good for the United States. And now we have the official word from the Congressional Budget Office confirming that it will reduce our nation's deficit and grow our nation's economy. As you can see in this graph, the Congressional Budget Office's analysis shows that our bill will increase the United States gross domestic product by 3.3% in the first 10 years after its enactment and 5.4% in the second 10 years after its enactment. That means the bipartisan immigration reform we're debating in the Senate will actually grow our economy, not harm it, as some of the ardent opponents have tried to argue. I've been saying this all along. Bringing 11 million people out of the shadows will increase our economic growth, and now we know by how much. The Congressional Budget Office also tells us that we reduce the deficit by $197 billion over the next decade and by another $700 billion more between 2024 and 2033 through changes in direct spending and revenues. We're talking about almost $1 trillion in deficit spending that we can lift from the backs of the next generation by giving 11 million people a pathway to productive citizenship. I've been saying all along, bringing 11 million people out of the shadows and fixing our broken immigration system will increase the gross domestic product and decrease the deficit, and now we know by how much. The report found that revenue will come in payroll taxes, income taxes, fees, and fines, estimated to be about $459 billion in the first 10 years and $1.5 trillion in the second 10 years. It also found that there will be fewer unauthorized individuals coming into the United States as a result of our bill. Now, contrary to what my colleague from Alabama has continuously claimed on the floor of the Senate, the CBO found, and I quote, that the border enforcement and security provisions of this bill along with the implementation of the mandatory employment verification system, would decrease the net future flows of unauthorized people into the United States. The bottom line of this report is clear. What the CBO numbers tell us is that 11 million people living in fear and in the shadows are not, as some would have us believe, part of America's problem, but bringing them out of the shadow is actually part of the solution and part of strengthening America's economic future. They are a key to economic growth, and immigration reform will help save the Social Security and Medicare trust funds. What we realize today is that giving 11 million people a pathway, an arduous pathway nonetheless, a tough pathway, go through a criminal, come forth and register with the government, first of all, let's know who's here, go through a criminal background check, have to pass that background check because if you don't, you get deported, and then ultimately pay your taxes, learn English, and after more than a decade, earn your way towards citizenship. And fixing that broken immigration system is, in effect, an economic growth strategy and exactly the right thing to do. Frankly, Madam President, the CBO numbers negate any reasonable argument the opponents of this legislation have. Every argument they have made is based on one thing and one thing only, that those people living in the shadows, those people trying to earn a living, those people trying to keep their families together are a symptom of American decline. And our history of immigration clearly contradicts those arguments, and the CBO numbers confirm it. The opponents of this legislation couldn't be more wrong. Giving 11 million people a pathway to citizenship while strengthening our enforcement efforts is not a symptom of decline. On the contrary, it is a symbol of America's hope and a validation of American values, what we stand for as a nation and who we are as a people. And I believe a new generation of immigrants willing to work hard and contribute to the economy will help make this another century of American exceptionalism. I say to my friends on the other side, and I say to my friend from Alabama who appears to have only gotten the CBO score for the first 10 years, not the second 10 years, even though I understand he was the one who asked for the CBO to score the second 10 years, but apparently the second 10 years holds an inconvenient truth for my friend. The good news in this analysis actually gets better in the second 10 years. The CBO reports that immigration reform will reduce the deficit by $700 billion, increase wages by 0.5%, increase GDP by 5.4%, and increase productivity and innovation. As I listened to the senator from Alabama make his remarks about the CBO's report on wages, I don't think the numbers say what he believes they say. He was talking about how American family wages would go down, and the report explicitly says that's not the case. In fact, Ezra Klein wrote yesterday in the Washington Post that the idea that immigration would lower wages of already working Americans is, quote, actually a bit misleading. As for folks already here, CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, is careful to note that their estimates do not necessarily imply that current U.S. residents would be worse off in the first 10 years. And in the second 10 years, they estimate that the average American's wages will actually rise. In addition, in case my friend from Alabama missed it, the report also says although immigrants constituted 12% of the population in the year 2000, they accounted for 26% of U.S.-based Nobel Prize winners, and they made up 25% of public venture-backed companies started between 1990 and 2005. The fact is, immigrants receive patents at twice the rate of native-born U.S. population. The bottom line, as Ezra Klein puts it, quote, the bill's overall effect on the overall economy is unambiguously positive. This is encouraging news for the American economy and validates what many of us have known all along. I would only say let's not take a report from the Congressional Budget Office and twist it for political purposes and then preach to the fears of those who would oppose this legislation, no matter how encouraging and positive the CBO numbers are. And I'm already beginning to hear the voices who, of course, are rejecting the CBO's analysis. I find it interesting. I stand on this floor very often and listen to my colleagues who use the CBO numbers when it inures to their benefit, but reject it when it doesn't. You can't do that. You can't have it both ways. This is a reason to move forward, not a reason for further obstruction. The Congressional Budget Office report is encouraging enough, in my view, to make this legislation part of an economic recovery strategy and a long-term competitiveness strategy. I ask the opponents of the legislation, don't stand in the way of economic growth. Don't stand in the way of economic recovery. Let's say yes to immigration reform. Even those voices who I'm not in concert with, Grover Norquist, President of Americans for Tax Reform, said yesterday, today's CBO score is more evidence that immigration is key to economic growth. Immigration reform will jumpstart America's economy and reduce our national debt. He went on to say, I urge Congress to fix our broken immigration system for the sake of the American economy. Now, I don't usually agree with Grover Norquist, so the fact that we can actually agree on this issue means we've done something right in the Gang of Eight, something worthy of the support of even of some of my most conservative colleagues. I think my friends on the other side are out of arguments. Ezra Klein does a good job of bottom-lining the CBO analysis. He says, quote, this isn't just a good CBO report. It is a wildly good CBO report. They're basically saying immigration reform is a free lunch. It cuts the deficit by growing the economy. It makes Americans better off, and it makes immigrants better off. At a time when the U.S. economy desperately needs a bit of help, this bill, according to the Congressional Budget Office, helps. And politically, it forces opponents of the bill onto the ground they're least comfortable occupying. They have to argue that immigration reform is bad for cultural or ethical reasons rather than economic ones. So the good news in this CBO report about the economic benefits of immigration reform is exactly one of the reasons why 70% of Americans support it. It's good for the economy. Once again, we realize the breadth of support for this legislation goes far beyond politics or demographics or elections. It goes to our responsibility to the economy and to our country. We have an obligation to pass this legislation if we want to fix our immigration system and rebuild our economy. To those opponents of immigration reform who tell us that those people will come here and use services, demand more, and bankrupt the system, I would point them to this graphic. The sizable deficit reduction from immigration reform in the first 10 years is actually dwarfed by the amount of immigrants will continue to contribute in reducing the national deficit in the second 10 years. This clearly shows immigration reform is good for America now and in the long term. People have long realized, and the CBO numbers show us, that this legislation is, without a doubt, the right thing to do. It benefits all of us as a nation. These are people who have come here to work, contribute to our economy and our economic competitiveness, pay their taxes, and be part of the dream. The CBO report simply puts numbers to what that dream is all about and what we've known all along. With that, Madam President, I yield the floor.
The senator from Michigan.
Thank you, Madam President. As Chair of the Agriculture, Nutrition and Forestry Committee, I rise today to speak about the urgent need for comprehensive immigration reform. I, too, along with the distinguished senator from New Jersey, want to indicate that this is very good news, that this is not only good in a number of ways to have a legal system that is working for the economy, but we're actually going to see deficit reduction. Saving money as well as providing certainty in the economy for workers and businesses, a legal system that works for people, for families, business workers, is extremely positive. And I want to congratulate all of my colleagues, friends on both sides of the aisle who have worked so hard, the leader of the Judiciary Committee, the leader of the Immigration Subcommittee, all of those on both sides of the aisle who have worked so hard to make this happen. I particularly want to thank Senator Dianne Feinstein, Senator Bennett, and others who have worked very hard on a portion of the bill that relates to agriculture, because in agriculture we need comprehensive immigration reform. It's critically important for farmers from Michigan, Wisconsin, to Alabama, to California, and everywhere in between. As you know, we passed our Farm Bill with wide bipartisan support a week ago, and in the debate we talked a lot about risk management and making sure that farmers have a safety net when they experience a disaster, whether it be a drought, a late freeze, or other severe weather. But what about when the weather's good, the sun shines, there's enough rain but not too much, and it falls all at the right times, and the crops grow and ripen, and then there aren't enough people to harvest it, which has happened too many times in Michigan. When that happens, crops rot in the fields, unpicked, unsorted, and unsold. In California last year, peach growers saw much of their crop rot on the trees because they couldn't find enough workers. One farmer outside Marysville, California, said that he was losing 5% of his peaches every day, because he couldn't get enough farm workers, and the system didn't work. And this year, grapefruit growers are already behind on picking by 2 weeks because of the labor shortage. We need a legal system that works. In Alabama in 2011, thousands of farm workers fled the state as a new immigration law was passed and undermined the ability to get quality legal workers. Brian Cash, a tomato grower on Chandler Mountain, said that one day he had 64 workers, and the next day, when the new law made it a crime to not carry valid documents at all times and force police to check on anyone they suspect was here illegally, and the way that this was put together, which was not workable, he went from 64 workers to 11. So we need a system that works, that's realistic, that makes sure that everyone, in fact, is here, documented legally, but it has to be done in a way that works for farmers and workers. And because he didn't have enough workers to harvest his 125 acres, he watched his tomato crop rot in the field, and that loss cost him $100,000. In my home state of Michigan last year, we couldn't get enough workers to help harvest the crops up and down the west side of the state. Asparagus grower Jim Baker, who runs the Michigan Asparagus Advisory Board, reports that 97% of Michigan asparagus is harvested by hand, and almost all of our hand harvest labor comes from migrant workers, and that means that much of our asparagus crop, unfortunately, last year was left in the field. This is all left in the field, all of this, and what's happened. Alan Overheiser from Costco Township, Michigan, grows peaches and apples on 225 acres. He typically hires 25 to 30 seasonal workers, but right now he only has 2. He said, I think one thing people don't understand is that people we normally hire are skilled at this work. They work hard. It's just not something that anyone can do or wants to do. We have skilled people that we need every year. I think that's probably the myth out there that somehow this isn't important or skilled work. The reality is that we're in the business of providing safe, high-quality food that people want to buy. It takes a skilled workforce. It's hard work, and they just aren't everywhere. We need to have a legal system that farmers can count on to be able to have the skilled labor that they need. Diane Smith, the executive director of the Michigan Apple Committee, said that because last year's crop harvest was lost to weather disaster, many farm workers, of course, moved on to different jobs. In fact, she said apple growers from Michigan to Washington are desperate to get back the skilled workers that they need, and that growers are hearing that until immigration is worked out, until there is a legal system they can trust and count on, that workers they've worked with for years aren't willing to come back to the U.S. Russ Costanza grows squash, peppers, cucumbers, tomatoes, and eggplants on his Michigan farm. In the 1960s, every farm worker his father hired came from nearby Benton Harbor, Michigan. As of 2010, not a single worker came from that city. Again, the challenges of finding farm workers, those who are skilled, who want to do this kind of work. Fred Leitz, who also farms near Benton Harbor, says that American workers don't want to work in the fields. He's reached out to find workers and finds it's a particular kind of work that most American workers are not interested in doing. In 2009, migrant workers held 200 of the 225 jobs at his apple orchard, and he says he'd be out of business without their help, and he has to have a legal system that works so that he knows he's following the law, so that people know they're following the law, they can count on it, and they can have the skilled workers that they need every year. Today, 77% of our country's farm workers are foreign-born. These are men and women who work in extremely difficult jobs. They are people who need and want to follow the law. We've got to make sure the law works. We need immigration reform to make sure we have an accountable system. And for our workers who put in so much effort all year long only to watch their crops rot in the fields, we need immigration reform. We need a legal system that works. If they don't have workers to pick all their crops, then farmers are going to plant fewer acres. The effect of a labor shortage can be just as devastating and disastrous on our food supply and our families' grocery bills as a drought or a freeze. So there's no two ways about it. We need to pass this bill. We need immigration reform. We need a system that's accountable, that's credible, that's legal, and that works. Farmers and farm workers organizations are strongly endorsing this bill because fixing our immigration system is what the bill before us is all about. And I'm very pleased that people have come together, those representing workers, those representing farmers, have come together to find something that actually is a good balance and works for everyone in this sector of the economy. This bill first creates a way for current undocumented workers to obtain legal status through the Blue Card program if they've worked at least 100 work days or 575 hours from January 1, 2010 through December 31, 2012. All the Blue Card holders will receive biometric identification. Employers will be required to provide a record of their employment to the Department of Agriculture as well. And to be eligible then for a green card, the workers must have worked for at least 100 days per year for 8 years prior to enactment, or 150 days for 5 years prior to enactment, and they also would have to show that they pay taxes on their income that they earn while in Blue Card status, that they have not been convicted of any felony or violent misdemeanor as well. Next, the bill also establishes an agricultural worker program to assign work visas for immigrant workers who don't wish to live in the United States but want to be able to come to the United States to be able to work legally. Workers must register with the USDA and pay a registration fee, and the USDA will create an electronic employment monitoring system, similar to our current student and exchange visitor information system to track temporary workers. This bill ensures a review of the visa cap after 5 years so we can see how the program is working for farmers and for farm workers. It also gives the Secretary of Agriculture the power to increase the number of visas in an emergency, as in a situation where we don't have enough workers and the crops are actually rotting in the fields. In addition, any workers who are unemployed for more than 60 days or breach a contract with an employer will have to leave the United States. Furthermore, the bill provides much-needed certainty for farmers and for workers when it comes to wages. Under the bill, farmers will know how much to plan to spend on help, and workers will know how much to plan on earning for their work. Finally, farm workers must hire eligible and qualified American workers. Farm employers must hire eligible and qualified American workers before filling any shortages of workers through the visa program. So as always, and certainly a high priority for me, is to make sure American workers have the first opportunity for these jobs, and it's only a situation in which there are not Americans applying and wishing to have this employment that we would then turn to those who are legally here, who are foreign-born. We are the top agriculture export country in the world. The top. It's one of the bright spots for us. And as I've said so many times, 16 million people work in this industry. We can't continue to be the top export country if we leave crops in the fields or on the trees because we don't have a legal system that works and we don't have legal employees who are here, workers who are here legally who can do the work. So we need to pass this bill. There are many reasons to pass this bill. One is to make sure that we are actually picking from the trees, the fruit trees, not letting things fall and rot on the ground, the precious food that we are growing across the country. We need to pass this bill because our food supply and the world's food supply depends on being able to get the crops out of the fields. We have done a great job working together to produce a 5-year farm bill that addresses everything from research and support for farmers when they have disasters to conservation practices, trade, local food systems, rural development, on and on and on. The one piece that we can do now that will really give American agriculture a positive 1-2 punch is to pass this bill. It is a balance. It's been worked out among all those involved in the agricultural economy, both from a business standpoint and a worker standpoint, and everyone is very clear. The system is broken. It doesn't work. It doesn't work for anybody right now. We need a system that works, that's accountable, that has the right kind of balance, that of course puts American workers first, but allows our farmers to be able to have the legal workers that they need as well in that process. This bill makes sense, and Madam President, I would urge that my colleagues support it. Thank you.